The wind howled like a wounded beast, shrieking through the pine trees with a cold so sharp it cut through skin and bone. Snow swirled thick in the air, blinding, merciless. Each step Caroline took felt like dragging her body through a wall of ice. Her legs trembling with every movement. Her coat was too thin, her shawl threadbare, and her boots, cracked at the seams, slipped against the frozen earth. The trail, if it could even be called that, had long vanished beneath fresh snowfall. She had no strength left. Not really. Every part of her ached, her back from carrying the baby, her arms from clutching them both close, her chest from the tight pull of grief and cold air. Her breath came in short, painful gasps, fogging out in front of her face only to vanish in the storm. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Caroline Moore had already lost too much. She wouldn't lose them too. The infant strapped to her chest whimpered, a weak, rasping sound that made her heart crack. Emily hadn't opened her eyes in over an hour, and Caroline couldn't feel the baby's fingers through the blanket anymore. And James, oh, James. The boy trudged behind her, lips blue, his small hand clinging to her coat with everything he had. He didn't speak. He hadn't in miles. His cheeks were raw from the wind, his eyes glassy with fatigue. Caroline wanted to scream, to collapse, to lie down and let the storm bury her. But what would happen to them? That thought alone forced her forward. One more step, one more breath. Her mind wandered to the night the fire took St. Elms, took her husband, took the life they had scraped together with so little for so long. She hadn't even had time to mourn. Not properly. There was no time for tears when the roof caved in and she'd barely managed to pull the children out in time. They'd lost everything. No home, no money, no family left to turn to. Just memories buried in ashes and the unbearable weight of survival. So she walked, with no destination but forward. For 30 miles, maybe more, through silence and snow and hunger. Through blistered feet and frozen fingers. Through hopelessness so thick it strangled her. She should have collapsed long ago. She was running on nothing but instinct now, raw, maternal instinct that whispered, keep going. And then, a flicker of smoke. At first, she thought it was her mind playing cruel tricks. A trick of the light. Maybe, or the desperate hallucinations of a dying woman. But no, there it was again. Rising through the trees. Smoke. From a chimney. Caroline squinted through the snow. Her legs buckled, and she nearly dropped to her knees. But she caught herself, her arms tightening around the infant. Her teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached. Just a little further. She didn't remember crossing the last stretch. Only that suddenly the trees thinned and there it was, a cabin. Small and rough, but with a light glowing from the window and a thin curl of smoke drifting from the chimney. Salvation, if such a thing still existed. The porch was only a few steps away. But those steps felt like miles. She reached for the rail but missed and stumbled hard into the doorway. Her shoulder thudding against the frame with a dull, heavy sound. She was dimly aware of James tugging her coat. Mama, he whispered. His voice was barely there. Mama, don't sleep? She tried to answer him. Tried to say something, anything, but the words froze in her throat. Her eyes blurred. Her knees buckled. Then, a sound. Footsteps. The door opened, and standing there was a man. Tall, weathered, wrapped in a coat dusted with snow. A rifle slung across his back. His eyes, deep beneath the brim of a wide hat, narrowed as he looked her over, then looked at the children. Without a word, he dropped his coat onto James's shoulders, scooped the baby from her chest, and said only one thing, "Get in." Caroline tried to move but couldn't. The last thread holding her together had finally snapped. Her legs gave out, but he caught her like a man who had done this before, carried heavy things. Carried burdens. Inside the cabin, warmth hit her like a wave. A fire roared in the hearth. She barely registered being laid down. Or the way he moved quickly, gloves off. Checking her pulse, her lips, her hands. She shook her head when he asked if she was hurt. Just cold, she managed. He worked fast, piling blankets over the children, tucking them in like they were his own. Then he handed her a mug. It was hot and bitter and so strong it nearly burned, but it lit a fire in her chest. She didn't even know his name. But she whispered, "Thank you," and he nodded, like that was enough. She didn't want to fall asleep, not yet. But the warmth, the relief, the overwhelming weight of everything crashed over her all at once. And as her eyes closed, she heard his voice, quiet and certain. "You're safe now." Caroline had spent so many years learning how not to expect help that when it finally came, quiet, steady, and without condition, it left her breathless. Wade wasn't a man of many words. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations. When she'd collapsed on his porch with 2 frozen children and nothing but desperation in her arms, he hadn't interrogated her like the others had. He'd just opened the door and made space. And that, more than the fire, the blankets, the stew, was what undid her. Space, dignity, safety, all without price. She hadn't known what to make of him at first. There was grief in his silence. But not the kind that festered. It had sharpened him, not hardened him. He moved like a man who had seen loss up close and chosen, somehow, not to turn bitter. When he caught her before she hit the ground. When he wrapped her boy in his own coat and cradled the baby like he'd done it before. Something inside her cracked. No one had carried her in years. No one had shielded her from anything since before the fire took St. Elm's, and with it, her husband, her home, her place in the world. Wade didn't make promises, but he kept showing up. And every quiet act of care felt like one. It was the second morning when the townsfolk came. She had just started to feel her hands again when she heard the sound of hooves crunching over frost. 2 men rode into view, grim-faced, cold-eyed. She recognized one, Sheriff Langley. The other was Travis Finch, who ran the trading post and rarely said anything kind unless someone was watching. Wade stepped out first, coat hanging heavy on his shoulders, shotgun across his arms. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move fast, but he stood between them and the door like a wall. "She's with me," he said. Langley squinted. "She ain't wanted, Wade, but folks are nervous. She shows up out of nowhere. Kids in tow, no name, no story. She's not trouble. She might bring it." Caroline stood just inside, arms around Emily, heart pounding like war drums. She wanted to hide, to disappear like she always had when men started questioning her right to exist. But Wade didn't flinch. "She lost her husband in the fire," he said, voice firm. "Walked 30 miles through snow to keep those kids alive. She's a stranger. She's a mother," he snapped, for the first time letting steel bleed into his tone. "And she's staying." There was a beat of tense silence. Then Langley sighed, adjusted his reins. "Your land, your call, Wade, but if anything happens, it won't." And that was that. They turned their horses and rode off, dust trailing behind them. Inside, Caroline stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest, her throat tight. Wade turned slowly, met her eyes. "They won't come back." She wanted to say something, anything, but the words lodged deep. "They think I'm poison," she whispered at last. "That'll bring sickness, bad luck, ruin." He didn't deny it, didn't feed her false comfort. Instead, he said simply, "Let them think it." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because no one did it for me." Her knees nearly gave out again, not from exhaustion this time, but from the weight of being seen. She wasn't just a mouth to feed. She wasn't a burden, a ghost, a cursed shadow drifting between pity and blame. She was a mother who had refused to die. And he saw that, saw her. That night, she lay in front of the fire, her children breathing slow and steady on either side. The cot creaked as Wade lowered himself into the chair across from her, cleaning the barrel of his rifle in silence. The baby stirred. She reached down, soothed him with one hand. "I don't know how to thank you," she said into the quiet. "You don't have to. But I do," she insisted, voice soft. "You stood in front of them. For me. I wasn't letting them take you," he said simply. "Why?" He looked at her then, fully, his eyes shadowed by firelight but clear. "Because I've seen what happens when no one stands up." 3 days later, Lester Crowley came, drunk, mean, armed. He shouted outside the cabin, slurring curses and calling her a witch. A curse, a storm bringer. Claimed his calf died the day she showed up. Said he'd come to drive her out himself. Caroline shook as she gathered the children. James gripped her sleeve. Emily cried. Outside, Wade didn't shout. He didn't run. He walked. He told Lester to leave. Lester raised his gun. Wade didn't wait. One shot. Fast and clean. Lester dropped into the snow like a stone. Caroline saw it all from the doorway. Her breath caught. Her hands trembled. Wade turned back. Rifle lowered. His jaw locked tight. She stepped aside to let him in, not in fear, but in trust. And something shifted. He hadn't done it to prove anything. He'd done it because her safety mattered. Because he had drawn a line and said, no further. Later, when the baby was asleep and the wind died down, Caroline sat beside him on the porch, a mug of coffee cradled in her hands. You didn't have to do that, she said. He stared ahead. Yes, I did. Why? He looked at her then, his voice steady as ever. Because I'd do it again. And she knew he meant it. No promises, no declarations, just presence, just action. And for the first time in years, Caroline Moore felt something crack open inside her. Not fear, not sorrow, safety. And beneath that, so quietly she barely recognized it, love. The cabin wasn't large, but in the quiet hum of its fire and creaking wood, something gentle was growing, not loud, not sudden, just steady. Caroline didn't know when it started. Maybe the first night, when Wade knelt beside her shivering children without being asked. Maybe it was when he handed her that bitter cup of coffee on the porch without speaking. Just watching the sky brighten with her. Or maybe it was when she caught him tucking an extra blanket over James in the middle of the night. Like it was instinct, not duty. Whatever it was, it didn't need to be named. It just was. At first, they lived like two people thrown together by circumstance, careful, quiet, moving around each other like fog around trees. She offered to sweep, mend, cook. He nodded, said thank you, but never once did he treat her like she owed him anything. And somehow, in that space of unspoken grace, she began to exhale. When the fever came, it stripped away every mask. Caroline didn't remember much, only heat. And dreams that burned. She heard her children crying. Wade's voice low and firm. Cloth on her forehead. A mug pressed to her lips. She drifted in and out of consciousness, calling for names she hadn't spoken aloud in years. And still, he stayed. She woke one morning, sweat drying on her skin, throat dry and aching, and found Wade beside her, asleep in the chair, his hand still wrapped around hers. You stayed, she whispered, voice hoarse. His eyes blinked open slowly, then met hers without surprise. Where else would I be? The words burrowed deep. After the fever, they didn't rush back into rhythm. She was slower, softer, and he gave her time. He didn't speak when she burned the bread the first time she tried to cook again. Didn't scold when she forgot to check the pot or dropped a bowl from shaking hands. He just stepped in, calm as ever, tossed the ruined bread into the snow and said, "It's just bread, no one died." Caroline's eyes stung. "But I need to be useful." "You're here," he replied gently. "That's enough for now." And somehow, it was. They sat on the porch most evenings after the children had gone to bed. Sometimes they shared coffee, sometimes just silence. Wade would whittle small wooden animals for Emily or show James how to carve notches in firewood. Caroline watched him, memorizing the way he moved with certainty but never rush. He never touched her unless she reached first. And when she did, when she handed him a bowl and their fingers brushed, or when she placed her hand on his arm in thanks, he stilled like the world was holding its breath. No confessions, no grand gestures, just warmth, trust. One night, snow whispered against the roof and the children slept with dreams still on their lips. Caroline sat by the fire, sewing a new button onto James's coat. Wade sat across from her, sharpening a blade with steady hands. She looked up and said softly, "You've been alone a long time." He didn't deny it. "So have I." Wade nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a truth between them both. "Doesn't feel so lonely now." Her hands stilled in her lap. "No," she said, "it doesn't." Another evening, she asked, "Why are you so kind to me?" Wade took his time before answering. "Because you walked through a storm to save your children." He looked over at her then, eyes soft. "And because I see something in you that says you did again." Caroline didn't speak, just reached across the space between them and rested her hand on his. His fingers closed around hers, rough, calloused, familiar now. They sat like that for a long time. There were still hard days. Mornings when Caroline woke from dreams of fire and ash. Afternoons when she'd forget herself and call for her late husband. Nights when James curled into her side and asked if they were safe forever now. But always, Wade was there, not to promise peace, but to hold the space until the fear passed. And something about that was more comforting than any vow. She caught him once, carving the baby's name, Thomas, into a cedar plaque for the crib he'd built with his own hands. She watched him from the doorway, sun warming the cabin roof, the baby asleep in her arms. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he replied, "but I wanted to." She looked at him then, not just the man who'd saved her, but the man who'd stayed. The man who asked for nothing but gave quietly, constantly. And in her chest, something unfolded, a soft, living thing that had nothing to do with obligation. A feeling born not from passion or desperation, but from choosing. Every day, each other. Weeks passed, and the snow began to melt. The path to town became less treacherous. Townsfolk, once cold, now nodded when they passed. A few even left food on the porch. The world hadn't fully forgiven, but it was softening. Inside the cabin, however, forgiveness wasn't needed. There was only understanding. Shared glances over firelight, a hand on the small of her back when she stood too quickly. The way he reached for her mug without asking. The way she folded his shirts with quiet care. They never said "I love you." But one night, as Caroline stood watching James and Emily chase fireflies outside the cabin, Wade stepped behind her, his voice low. "You built something here." She turned to him, eyes shining. "We did." He reached for her hand, and she let him, their fingers laced like roots. And as stars blinked awake above them, and laughter echoed across thawing earth, Caroline Moore leaned into the man who never asked her to prove herself, only made room for her to grow again. And in that, they both found something neither of them had dared hope for. Love, not declared, but lived. The storm had passed by morning, but the traces of it still clung to the land, the frost on the trees, the bruised clouds retreating westward, and the silence that came after something wild had howled all night. Inside the small cabin, however, a different kind of stillness had taken hold, not fear, but awe. Caroline lay on the cot near the fire, skin damp with sweat, chest rising and falling with the gentle rhythm of relief. Cradled in her arms, swaddled in soft flannel and letting out sleepy sighs, was the baby boy who had arrived too soon, yet full of fight. Thomas. Wade had carved the name into a cedar plaque that very morning, placing it at the foot of the cradle he'd built from salvaged fencewood. His hands were still stained from the effort, but his eyes were soft when he looked at the child, and softer still when they rested on Caroline. "You did it," he said, crouching beside her. She smiled through tears. "We did." The birth had been chaos. Wade had been miles away fixing the fence when the contractions started. Caroline had braced herself to do it alone. Not for the first time, but hopefully, she thought, for the last. When he burst through the cabin door, wild-eyed, breathless, James and Emily had lit the signal fire just in time. And Wade, steady as stone, had dropped everything to kneel beside her, whisper encouragements, boiling water, cradling her back as she screamed life into the world again. Now, as the baby suckled quietly against her chest, Caroline felt something she hadn't dared believe she was still capable of feeling. Joy. Not just survival, not just relief, but true, tear-brimming joy. The town found out by noon. Word in the mountains traveled faster than any rider. By the time Wade rode into town for medicine and fresh linens, the whispers had already begun. The widow had the baby. She birthed it in Wade's cabin. He stayed through the whole thing. And surprisingly, no one scoffed. No one laughed. Instead, they stared. The preacher's wife sent a jar of honey. The smith's daughter came with a basket of wool scraps. A quiet woman Caroline had never met left cornbread on the porch, wrapped in linen stitched with the initials M.A., Martha Allen. The same woman who had once hissed, "You brought death with you." Caroline blinked when Wade handed her the gifts. Still dusty from the ride. Why would they send anything? Because they saw, he said simply. They saw what you did. What you survived. What you brought into this world. A few days later, the preacher himself arrived. Not with fire and brimstone. Not to cast her out, but to offer supplies. He brought flour, soap, a book for the children. And when he looked down at the baby, his weathered hands trembled just slightly. Thomas, he repeated gently, reading the name carved into the cradle. A strong name, for a strong start. Caroline didn't know what to say. She simply nodded, lips trembling. He tipped his hat. The town, it's slow to come around. But they're watching, and they're remembering. You came here with nothing. And you built something good. Wade stood beside her, silent as always, but his presence was enough. A quiet shield, a quiet honor. The biggest surprise came the following week. A group of townsfolk, mostly women, walked up the trail. Nervous, bundled in shawls, holding baskets, warm smiles trembling like candles in wind. Caroline met them at the porch. Baby in her arms, James and Emily peeking from the doorway. They didn't ask to come in. They didn't expect a thank you. They simply placed the baskets down, vegetables, cloth diapers, a knitted cap, and then they did something Caroline never saw coming. They called her Mama, not mockingly, not with suspicion, but with affection. Mama Caroline, one woman said, kneeling to smile at Thomas. He's beautiful, just like his mama. Tears filled Caroline's eyes, and she looked over at Wade, who stood in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame. He gave her the smallest nod, one of pride, of quiet joy. Later that evening, Caroline sat on the porch, watching the sky turn from gold to rose to deep blue. The baby slept peacefully in her arms. Emily rested nearby with her new rag doll. James was carving something beside Wade, copying every movement of his hands. Caroline looked at them, this strange, beautiful little group of souls thrown together by fire, snow, and fate, and something bloomed in her chest. She had thought she would live and die unwanted. That after St. Elms, the world had written her off as cursed, as ruined, as one more broken woman with no place to go. But now she had a place. Not just to sleep, but to belong. Wade brought her a cup of tea, sat beside her, shoulder brushing hers. You think they mean it? She asked softly. The town? She nodded. I think they're learning, he said. They saw strength in you. Real strength. And that kind of thing, it changes people. I'm not sure I deserve all this, she whispered. Wade looked at her, eyes clear in the dusk light. You deserve every bit of it. You walked through hell. You kept those children alive. And you brought life into the world again. That's not something to hide. That's something to honor. She looked down at the baby, nestled warm against her chest. They're not staring anymore, she murmured. They're seeing. Wade took her hand, rough fingers curling around hers like a promise. They finally see what I saw the moment you knocked on my door. Caroline's eyes filled again, but this time, the tears were full of hope. That night, as the fire crackled and the wind outside whispered like a lullaby, Caroline sat with her family, not by blood, but by choice, and knew that she was no longer a guest. No longer a burden, no longer a rumor. She was a mother, a survivor, and someone worth knowing. And for the first time in her life, the world agreed. Spring came slowly to the mountains. The snow didn't melt all at once. It shrank in patches, along fence lines, beneath tree limbs, under the eaves of the cabin where sunlight lingered longest. But every day, the earth breathed a little deeper. Every day, the light stayed a little longer. And in that slow unfolding of warmth, Caroline Moore found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. Settling in. Not surviving, not passing through, not bracing for the next blow, but living. She still remembered what it felt like to arrive at the cabin, frozen, desperate, one heartbeat away from collapse. Back then, she'd believed she was only pausing, just long enough to catch her breath, to save her children. But then the days turned into weeks. Then came Thomas. And now, every time she looked around, she no longer saw someone else's space. She saw home. The baby's cradle stood by the hearth, hand-carved from weathered cedar. Wade had built it himself, sanding every edge smooth, lining it with a soft quilt Caroline had pieced together from scraps. At its foot, a small wooden plaque read Thomas, the name of the child she'd thought she might never live to meet. The name of the child who now gurgled and kicked happily in the morning light. Outside, James chased Emily around the garden bed. both of them laughing with the kind of joy that only comes when you feel safe. Caroline stood in the doorway, a mug of tea in her hands, her shawl pulled snug around her shoulders, and watched them play. They were hers, all of them, and for the first time, it no longer felt like she had to apologize for it. Wade joined her a moment later, dusting his hands on his pants, having just finished mending the barn door. He didn't speak right away, just stood beside her, watching the children, his face soft. They've grown fast, he said finally, voice low. They laugh more now, Caroline replied. They used to flinch at every loud sound. Wade nodded. They don't anymore. She turned toward him, because they know they're not leaving. He met her gaze, and in that quiet, steady look, she felt more comfort than 1,000 promises. It hadn't always been easy. There had been whispers, there had been fear, but over time, the town changed, or maybe she had. People no longer looked at her like she was a storm waiting to ruin something. They stopped calling her the widow from St. Elm's and started calling her by name. They came by with preserves, with cloth for the baby, with small gestures that spoke louder than any apology. And Caroline no longer ducked her head when she walked into town. She stood tall, held her son on her hip and smiled at strangers like she belonged there. Because she did. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, she and Wade sat on the porch watching the stars blink into view. The air still held a chill, but she was warm beneath the blanket he'd laid across her shoulders. She turned to him, her voice softer than usual. Do you ever think about what this would look like, if things had been different? Wade didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, he said, I used to. And now? He looked at her, really looked at her. Now I don't need to. Her breath caught, but not from surprise. She had known it, felt it in every gesture. Every moment of silence filled with understanding. You built all of this, she whispered. So did you. She shook her head. I was just trying to survive. And now you're doing more than that. He said, you're raising them, you're healing, you're giving them what they thought they'd lost. Caroline turned toward the open door, where Thomas slept soundly in the cradle Wade built, where the fire crackled low and golden. I never thought I'd have this again, she said. A home, a family, a man who, her voice trembled, who doesn't just stay out of obligation, but because he wants to. Wade's hand found hers. His grip was strong and familiar, rough and grounding. I stayed, he said, because you made this a place worth staying. She looked down at their hands, his work worn and steady, hers scarred but healing, and her heart filled to the brim. Days passed, then weeks. The cabin no longer echoed with the fear of uncertainty. Instead, it hummed with life, laughter, footsteps, the sounds of something growing stronger, deeper. Love didn't come with declarations. It came in the way Wade rubbed Thomas's back after feeding him. In the way Caroline added more sugar to Wade's coffee than he'd admit he liked. In the quiet smiles they shared over supper. In the bedtime stories, the planting of seeds, the soft hush of a lullaby sung just before dawn. They never spoke the word family aloud. But they didn't need to. It lived in everything they did. One Sunday morning, as they prepared to head to town for supplies, Emily tugged at Caroline's skirt and asked, Is Mr. Wade my papa now? Caroline knelt and brushed a strand of hair behind the girl's ear. He doesn't have to be your papa by blood, she said gently, but he's someone who chose to love us. And sometimes, that means more. Emily grinned, satisfied, and ran off to grab her doll. Wade stood nearby, pretending not to have heard. But when Caroline walked past, she saw the way his jaw clenched, the way his eyes shone. She said nothing, she just took his hand. And he held on tight. Caroline came to the mountains broken, worn, and nearly lost, but she stayed because someone opened a door and never closed it again. And in that cabin, on that land, with a man who never asked for proof of her worth, she built something better than survival. She built a life, not with those she was born to, but with those who chose her. And whom she chose in return.